Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most haunting mysteries. Picture this, a city that once housed over 1 million people, with marble palaces gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, where aqueduct delivered fresh mountain water to every neighborhood, where merchants from 3 continents traded exotic goods in bustling forums. Now imagine walking through that same city 400 years later, and finding only 30,000 souls wandering among crumbling ruins, wild animals roaming through abandoned temples, and weeds growing through the cracks of what were once the world's greatest roads. This isn't fiction. This is the story of Rome. And Rome wasn't alone. Across an empire that stretched from Britain to the Sahara, magnificent cities that had thrived for centuries simply vanished. Tonight we're going to uncover why the greatest urban civilization the ancient world had ever seen just disappeared. But before we step into these ghostly streets together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, especially if you're one of those wonderful souls who loves diving deep into history's mysteries. And if this story gives you the same chills it gives me, please share it with someone who appreciates a good mystery. Maybe that friend who's always talking about ancient civilizations, or your history-loving family members. Trust me, they'll thank you for it. And hey, I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from tonight? Your bedroom in Chicago? A dorm room in Austin? Maybe you're listening while walking your dog in Portland? Drop a comment and let me know. I'll always read them, and I love hearing from fellow history lovers. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's embark on this incredible journey through time together. You know, there's something almost eerie about standing in what used to be the center of the known world. If you've ever visited Rome today, you might have walked through the Forum Romanum, seeing those scattered columns and broken walls, tourist groups shuffling past with their selfie sticks. But close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine what Professor Greg Wolf from UCLA tells us it really looked like in the year 400 AD. The Forum wasn't a collection of romantic ruins. It was Times Square, Wall Street, and the National Mall all rolled into one. Picture massive marble buildings rising 5, 6, even 7 stories high, their facades covered in intricate carvings that would make modern architects weep with envy. The Basilica Julia alone could hold thousands of people conducting business, settling legal disputes, making deals that would affect trade routes stretching to India and China. And the noise! Oh, the glorious chaos of it all. Merchants shouting in Latin, Greek, Germanic dialects and languages that don't even exist anymore. The clip-clop of horses pulling carts loaded with silk from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic Sea, the rhythmic hammering of craftsmen in their workshops, the splash of fountains fed by aqueducts that carried water from mountains 60 miles away. But here's what really blows my mind about Roman cities, and this is something most people don't realize. They had amenities that some parts of the world didn't see again until the 1800s. We're talking about public bathhouses with heated floors, apartment buildings with running water on multiple floors, streets lit by oil lamps at night. According to archaeological studies by Dr. Catherine Dunbabin from McMaster University, the city of Rome alone had 11 massive aqueducts bringing in about 300 million gallons of fresh water every single day. That's enough to supply a modern city of 2 million people. And it wasn't just Rome. Let's take a trip to Londinium, that's London to us, in the year 350 AD. If you could time travel there, you'd find a thriving city of around 50,000 people. The Thames was bustling with ships from Gaul bringing wine and pottery, while British wool and silver flowed out to the continent. There were Roman baths, a massive amphitheatre, beautiful villas with Hippocaust heating systems, and a forum where you could buy everything from Spanish olive oil to Germanic jewellery. Or consider Lutetia, modern-day Paris. Picture this: a sophisticated city built on an island in the Seine, connected to both banks by elegant stone bridges. Roman engineers had turned this Celtic settlement into a miniature Rome, complete with an arena that could seat 15,000 spectators, public baths fed by natural hot springs, and roads connecting it to every corner of Gaul. Now here's where the story gets really fascinating and really tragic. These weren't just big villages that grew randomly. According to research by Professor James Ward Perkins from Oxford, Roman cities were planned with a precision that would impress modern urban planners. Every Roman city followed a similar template: straight roads intersecting at right angles, a central forum for business and politics, public buildings positioned for maximum efficiency, drainage systems that kept the streets clean, and walls designed by military engineers who understood siege warfare better than anyone. But you know what made these cities truly special? It was the people. Imagine being a merchant from Alexandria, arriving in Cologne for the first time. Despite being nearly 2,000 miles from home, you'd find familiar sights everywhere. The same style of public baths where you could relax after a long journey, the same types of shops selling similar goods, the same Roman coins accepted everywhere, and Latin spoken by educated locals. It was like being part of history's first truly global civilization. The economic engine powering all this was absolutely mind-blowing. We're talking about a trade network that makes modern globalization look simple. Archaeological evidence documented by Dr. Roberta Tomba from the British Museum shows Roman coins have been found in places as far away as Vietnam and India. Chinese silk was sold in British markets, while British hunting dogs were prized in Rome itself. Spices from Ceylon, that's Sri Lanka, were used in restaurants in Gaul, and German amber was crafted into jewellery for wealthy Roman ladies. But perhaps most importantly, Roman cities represented something revolutionary. The idea that hundreds of thousands of people could live together peacefully, productively, and prosperously. Sure, there were problems: slavery, inequality, political tensions, but the sheer audacity of creating cities that large, that complex, that interconnected was unprecedented in human history. So what happened? How does a civilization that's sophisticated, that powerful, that successful just fade away? How do cities that took centuries to build get abandoned in mere decades? The answer isn't simple, and it's definitely not what most people think. This isn't a story about barbarian hordes sweeping down and burning everything in sight, though they played their part. This isn't even really a story about the fall of an empire, though that happened too. This is a story about how civilizations are more fragile than we like to believe, how the systems we take for granted can unravel faster than we can imagine, and how the choices we make in times of crisis can echo through centuries. And trust me, as we dig deeper into this mystery, you're going to discover parallels to our own world that might keep you awake long after this story ends. Because the forces that emptied Roman cities, well, let's just say some of them sound remarkably familiar. But first, we need to understand just how incredible these Roman urban achievements really were, and why their collapse represents one of the greatest mysteries in human history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss the next part of this incredible journey. In our next section, we're going to step inside a Roman city at its absolute peak and experience the urban miracle that shocked the ancient world. So let's step back in time to the year 150 AD and walk through the streets of Trier, a city you've probably never heard of, but one that would have absolutely blown your mind. Trier, located in what's now Western Germany, was considered the Rome of the North, and trust me, that wasn't just Roman propaganda. Picture yourself as a wealthy merchant arriving at Trier's gates on a crisp autumn morning. The first thing that would stop you dead in your tracks: The sheer scale of everything. The city walls stretched for over 4 miles around the entire settlement, built from massive limestone blocks that stood 30 feet high. These weren't just walls, they were engineering marvels with 47 defensive towers, 4 main gates that looked like triumphal arches, and a sophisticated drainage system built right into the foundation. But here's what really sets your heart racing as you enter through the Porta Nigra. That's the Black Gate, which still stands today, by the way. The sound hits you first. The rhythmic hammering from metalworking shops, the rumble of wooden wheels on stone streets, voices calling out in a dozen different languages. Then the smells. Fresh bread from bakeries, the tang of leather from workshops, exotic spices from trading posts, and yes, occasionally something less pleasant from the sewers. Hey, even Roman cities had their moments. Now, let me blow your mind with some numbers that archaeologist Dr. Lothar Schwinden has pieced together from decades of excavation. Trier, at its peak, housed around 80,000 people. That might not sound huge by today's standards, but consider this. Paris wouldn't reach that population again until the 1100s, nearly 1,000 years later. And unlike medieval cities that would grow up haphazardly, Trier was planned with mathematical precision that would make modern city planners jealous. The main street, the Cardo Maximus, was perfectly straight and wide enough for 2 full-sized Roman wagons to pass each other comfortably. Along this avenue stood shops that would make modern malls look quaint. 3-story buildings with workshops on the ground floor, living quarters on the second floor, and storage in the upper levels. The facades were decorated with colourful frescoes and mosaics that told stories of gods, heroes, and yes, successful business deals. But here's where Roman urban planning gets really impressive. Every single building in Trier was connected to not 1, but 2 separate water systems. The first brought fresh drinking water from springs in the Eifel Mountains 30 miles away. Engineers had calculated the exact gradient needed, just a gentle slope of 2 feet per mile, to keep water flowing steadily without erosion. The second system carried away wastewater through an underground network that would make modern sanitation engineers nod in approval. And speaking of impressive infrastructure, let's talk about something that still gives me goosebumps: the Imperial Baths of Trier. Picture a complex covering nearly 15 acres. That's bigger than 10 football fields. These weren't just places to get clean. They were social clubs, business centres, gyms and spas all rolled into one. According to research by Professor Hans-Peter Kühnen from the University of Trier, the caldarium, or hot room, was heated to a toasty 104 degrees Fahrenheit by a Hipparchus system that circulated hot air through hollow walls and floors. Romans would spend hours here, not just bathing, but making business deals, gossiping about politics, playing board games, or getting massages with imported oils. Can you imagine having a place like that in your neighbourhood, where you could go every day to relax, socialise, and conduct business all at the same time? Now here's something that really showcases Roman ingenuity: the amphitheatre. Trier's arena could seat 20,000 spectators. That's 1 in 4 residents. But the engineering behind it was pure genius. The builders carved it directly into a hillside using the natural slope for seating, while creating underground chambers for gladiators, wild animals, and stage machinery. They even installed a sophisticated drainage system that could flood the arena floor for mock naval battles, then drain it completely in under an hour. But you know what really made Roman cities special? It was the diversity. Archaeological evidence from Trier shows us merchants from Britain selling woolen cloaks, traders from Gaul offering fine pottery, Germanic craftsmen creating beautiful metalwork, and even evidence of trade goods from as far away as India and China. In a single marketplace, you could buy British beer, Italian wine, Spanish olive oil, and Germanic amber jewellery. The residential areas tell an equally fascinating story. The wealthy lived in sprawling villas with private courtyards, mosaic floors depicting scenes from mythology, and hippocaust heating in every room. But even ordinary citizens enjoyed amenities that most of medieval Europe wouldn't see again for centuries. Apartment buildings, the Romans called them insulae, featured running water, shared latrines with actual toilet paper, well, sponges on sticks, but still, and ground floor shops where residents could buy everything from fresh bread to imported silk. Here's something that always amazes me. Roman cities were incredibly cosmopolitan. Tombstone inscriptions from Trier mention people from Africa, Syria, Spain, Britain, and dozens of Germanic tribes, all living and working together. A Syrian merchant might live next door to a British soldier's family, while a Germanic craftsman's daughter might marry a Gallic wine trader's son. This level of cultural integration wouldn't be seen again in European cities until the modern era. And the technology? Oh, the technology would have seemed like magic to people from other civilizations. Trier had street lighting, oil lamps maintained by city workers who lit them every evening and extinguished them at dawn. There were public libraries with thousands of scrolls, public schools where children learned to read and write in Latin, and even a postal system that could carry messages across the empire faster than anything the world would see again until the invention of the telegraph. But perhaps most impressive was the sheer audacity of Roman urban planning. These weren't cities that just grew randomly around a market or fortress. According to Professor Ward Perkins' groundbreaking research, every Roman city was designed as a miniature version of Rome itself, with the same basic layout, the same types of buildings, the same civic institutions. It was like having a franchise system for civilization. You could travel from Hadrian's Wall in northern England to the Sahara Desert in Africa and find familiar urban environments everywhere you went. The economic sophistication was equally mind-blowing. Trier had banks that could transfer money to accounts in other cities, insurance companies that protected merchants' cargo during long-distance trade, and even what we'd recognize today as corporations, business partnerships that could outlast their founders and operate across multiple cities simultaneously. Now, I want you to imagine the confidence it took to build something like this. Roman engineers didn't just plan for their own lifetimes, they built for eternity. Those massive aqueducts were designed to serve cities for centuries. The road networks were planned to handle traffic loads that wouldn't be matched again until the automobile age. The amphitheatres and bathhouses were built with the assumption that Roman civilization would last forever. And for over 4 centuries it seemed like they were right. Cities like Trier weren't just surviving, they were thriving, growing, innovating. The population was increasing, trade was expanding, and new technologies were being developed and shared across the empire. If you were a Roman citizen in 150 AD, you might have reasonably assumed that your great-great-grandchildren would live in an even more magnificent city than yours. But here's where our story takes a darker turn, and where the mystery really begins to unfold. Because all of this confidence, all of this sophisticated urban planning, all of this incredible infrastructure, it was built on foundations that were far more fragile than anyone realized. What if I told you that beneath all this urban magnificence lay an economic system so complex, so interconnected, and so dependent on perfect conditions that even small disruptions could trigger catastrophic failures? The economic engine that powered these urban miracles was about to face challenges that its creators never saw coming. What I'm about to tell you might completely change how you think about ancient economics. Because behind all those magnificent Roman cities we just explored was an economic machine so sophisticated, so ruthlessly efficient, that it makes modern capitalism look like a lemonade stand. And understanding this economic engine isn't just fascinating, it's absolutely crucial to understanding why everything eventually collapsed. Let me take you inside the mind of Marcus Aurelius Gaius, not the emperor, but a fictional merchant whose story is based on real, archaeological evidence from the trading archives of Canis, an ancient city in modern-day Turkey. It's the year 180 AD, and Marcus has just received what we'd call today a business opportunity of a lifetime. Picture Marcus sitting in his villa in Aquileia, a massive port city at the northern tip of the Adriatic Sea. He's just gotten word through the Roman postal system, which, by the way, could deliver messages across the empire faster than anything Europe would see again until the 1800s, that there's a shortage of British wool in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, here's where the Roman economic system gets absolutely mind-blowing. Marcus doesn't just think locally, he thinks globally. Within a week, he's arranged to purchase wool from producers in northern Britain, transport it via Roman roads to Londinium, ship it down the Thames to Roman merchant vessels, sail across the English Channel to Gaul, then down the Rhone River to the Mediterranean, across to Alexandria, and finally distribute it to textile manufacturers throughout Egypt. The entire journey, over 4,000 miles through a dozen different provinces. But here's the kicker, and this is something that blows modern economists' minds. Marcus can do all of this using a single currency system, a unified legal framework and standardized weights and measures. Imagine if you could start a business in New York, buy materials in Japan, manufacture in Germany, and sell in Brazil, all using the same money, the same laws, and the same business practices. That's essentially what the Roman Empire offered to entrepreneurs like Marcus. Think about that for a second. How many different currencies do you need just to travel across Europe today? How many different legal systems, different regulations, different bureaucratic hoops? The Romans solved all of that 2,000 years ago. The numbers behind this economic miracle are staggering. Modern archaeological analysis of Roman merchant records suggests that the empire's total trade volume reached approximately 50 million tons of goods annually. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire annual trade volume of medieval Europe at its peak, except the Romans were moving this much stuff back in the 2nd century AD. Now, let's dive deeper into how this machine actually worked, because this is where things get really fascinating. The foundation of everything was the Roman road system, 25 major highways stretching over 50,000 miles, with another 200,000 miles of secondary roads connecting every significant settlement. But these weren't just paths through the wilderness. According to engineering studies by Professor Isaac Moreno Gallo from the University of Burgos, Roman roads were built like modern highways, multiple layers of foundation stones, drainage systems, mile markers, rest stops, and even the ancient equivalent of truck stops. A merchant travelling from Rome to Cologne, that's about 800 miles, could make the journey in just 40 days, including stops. Compare that to medieval travel times of 80-100 days for the same distance, and you start to understand the economic advantage. Speed meant fresher goods, lower spoilage rates, and the ability to respond quickly to market demands. But the real genius was in the financial systems. Romans had developed what we'd recognize today as letters of credit, international banking, insurance policies, and even joint stock companies. A merchant in Gaul could deposit money with a banker and withdraw the equivalent amount in Egypt, all without physically transporting a single coin. They had maritime insurance that covered shipwrecks, bandit attacks, and even what we'd call today acts of God. Let me give you a specific example that perfectly illustrates this sophistication. In 1900, archaeologists discovered a cache of business documents in the Roman fortress of Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall in northern England. Among these documents was a fascinating trade contract between a British wool merchant and a supplier in Gaul. The contract specified not just prices and delivery dates, but quality standards, penalty clauses for late delivery, insurance provisions, and even dispute resolution procedures. This level of commercial sophistication wouldn't reappear in Northern Europe until the Renaissance, over 1,000 years later. Can you imagine conducting business with that level of legal protection and financial security 2,000 years ago? The scale of specialization was equally impressive. Take the island of Rhodes, for example. By the 2nd century AD, Rhodes had become the ancient world's shipping insurance capital. According to research by Professor Nicholas Purcell from Oxford, Rhodian maritime law was so respected that merchants from Britain to Syria would specify Rhodian terms in their contracts. The island's entire economy was built around providing financial services to long-distance traders. They were essentially the ancient equivalent of Lloyd's of London. Or consider the Spanish silver mines of New Carthage. Modern estimates by mining historian Claude Domergue suggest these mines produced over 200 tons of silver annually at their peak. That's enough silver to mint 50 million denarii every year. This wasn't just random digging in the ground. The Romans had developed hydraulic mining techniques, used advanced engineering to drain underground water, and created the world's first industrial-scale mining operations. The social cost was horrific. It's estimated that 40,000 slaves worked these mines under brutal conditions, but the economic impact was revolutionary. And here's something that really showcases the interconnectedness of the Roman economy: the pepper trade. Black pepper from India was so valuable that it was literally used as currency in some transactions. Roman merchants had established permanent trading posts in Indian ports, and archaeologists have found Roman coins as far east as Vietnam and southern India. Professor Roberta Tomba's research at the British Museum shows that a single cargo ship arriving in Alexandria from India could carry enough pepper, silk, and spices to supply the entire Western Mediterranean for months. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Roman economic engine was its urban focus. Unlike medieval economies that would be primarily agricultural, Roman wealth was concentrated in cities. Urban populations weren't just consumers, they were producers, innovators, and the driving force behind economic growth. A city like Antioch with its 300,000 residents wasn't just a big town. It was a manufacturing centre producing textiles, metalwork, glass, pottery, and luxury goods that were exported across 3 continents. The taxation system that funded all of this was equally sophisticated and equally ruthless. Roman tax collectors, called publicani, operated what was essentially a franchise taxation system. They would bid for the right to collect taxes in specific provinces, paying the Roman treasury up front and then keeping whatever they could collect above that amount. It was capitalism applied to government revenue, and it generated enormous wealth for both the state and private collectors. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is crucial to understanding what comes next in our story. This entire economic miracle was built on 3 absolutely critical foundations: political stability, military security, and demographic growth. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, created the conditions where a merchant could invest in a 3-year trading venture to India without worrying about wars disrupting his routes. Roman legions protected trade routes from bandits and rival powers, and growing urban populations created ever-expanding markets for goods and services. For over 2 centuries, this system seemed invincible. Trade volumes grew, cities expanded, new technologies spread rapidly across the empire, and wealth accumulated at unprecedented rates. Roman merchants were living better than European royalty would live 1,000 years later. The middle class in major Roman cities enjoyed amenities, running water, central heating, public entertainment, diverse foods, educational opportunities that wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Revolution. But economic engines, no matter how sophisticated, are only as strong as their underlying assumptions. And those three critical foundations I mentioned, political stability, military security, and demographic growth, were about to face challenges that would test them to their breaking point. Because while Marcus Aurelius Gaius was calculating his profit margins on British wool, forces were already gathering on the empire's frontiers that would shatter this economic paradise forever, and the first cracks in the system were about to appear in the most unexpected places, threatening not just individual fortunes, but the very foundation of urban civilization itself. The year was 376 AD, and if you had been standing on the walls of Marcianopolis, a prosperous Roman city in modern-day Bulgaria, you would have witnessed something that no Roman had ever seen before. Stretching to the horizon was a sea of humanity. Over 200,000 Visigothic men, women and children, along with their wagons, livestock and everything they owned in the world. They weren't attacking, they were begging to come in. Now here's what makes this moment so fascinating and so tragic. These weren't the stereotypical barbarians that Hollywood loves to portray. The Visigoths had been Rome's neighbours for generations. Many had served in Roman armies, traded in Roman markets, and some had even become Roman citizens. Their king, Fritigern, spoke fluent Latin and had spent years at the imperial court. These were refugees, not raiders, fleeing from something so terrifying that they were willing to abandon their ancestral lands forever. What were they running from? The Huns. And if you think you know the story of Attila and his warriors, prepare to have your mind completely blown, because the reality was far more complex and far more devastating than any Hollywood epic. Let me paint you a picture of what was actually happening along Rome's northern frontier in the late 300s. For centuries, the Romans had managed their barbarian neighbours through a brilliant combination of diplomacy, bribery, military intimidation, and selective integration. It was like a massive, delicate balancing act. Germanic tribes would fight each other instead of Rome. Roman gold would keep friendly chiefs loyal, and the most ambitious young barbarian warriors would join Roman armies where they could find glory and wealth. But then the Huns arrived, and they shattered this carefully crafted system like a hammer hitting glass. The Huns weren't just another barbarian tribe. They were a migration phenomenon that historians now compare to a massive natural disaster. Picture entire peoples, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, moving across the steppes with a speed and coordination that left settled societies completely unprepared. According to research by Professor Peter Heather from King's College London, archaeological evidence suggests that the Hunnic migration displaced over 40 different tribal groups across Eastern Europe in less than 50 years. Can you imagine the chaos? Entire civilizations just moving, like dominoes falling one after another across the map of Europe. Now here's where most people get the story wrong. Popular culture loves to portray barbarian invasions as sudden, violent eruptions, savage hordes appearing out of nowhere to burn and pillage. But the reality was far more complex and in many ways far more devastating to Roman cities. Take the sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric's Visigoths. This wasn't a random raid by bloodthirsty savages. Alaric was a Roman general, yes, you heard that right, a Roman general, who had served the empire faithfully for years. He spoke Latin, understood Roman law, and had commanded Roman legions in battle. His men weren't wild barbarians. They were former Roman allies who had been systematically betrayed, underpaid, and mistreated by a Roman government that was falling apart from internal corruption. When Alaric finally marched on Rome, he tried 3 times to negotiate a peaceful settlement. He didn't want to destroy the city. He wanted to be paid what he was owed and given land for his people to settle. It was only after months of Roman duplicity and broken promises that he finally ordered his troops into the city. And even then, according to historian Edward Gibbon's detailed analysis, the sack was remarkably restrained by ancient standards. Churches were respected, civilians were largely spared, and many of Rome's greatest treasures were left untouched. But here's the crucial point. Alaric's march on Rome wasn't the cause of urban decline. It was a symptom of a system that was already breaking down. The real damage to Roman cities wasn't happening during dramatic sieges that make great movie scenes. It was happening slowly, invisibly, in the day-to-day breakdown of the economic and administrative systems that kept cities alive. Let me take you to Augusta Emerita, modern-day Mérida in Spain, to show you what I mean. In 380 AD, this was still a thriving provincial capital with over 50,000 residents, magnificent public buildings, and a bustling economy. Archaeological evidence from Professor Trinidad Nogales Basarate's excavations shows active construction projects, busy markets, and all the signs of a healthy Roman city. But by 450 AD, just 70 years later, the population had dropped to fewer than 10,000 people, and large sections of the city were abandoned. What happened? No dramatic siege, no barbarian horde burning down the walls. Instead, there was a slow strangulation of the systems that kept the city alive. Tax collection became irregular as barbarian groups disrupted rural areas. Trade routes became unsafe as bandit activity increased. The Roman administration gradually lost control of the countryside, which meant urban markets couldn't get the food and raw materials they needed. Here's a specific example that really illustrates this process. In 406 AD, a massive coalition of Vandals, Alans and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine River and poured into Gaul. But they didn't march straight to major cities and besiege them. Instead, they spread out across the countryside, settling wherever they found good land. For the rural population, this might have meant new landlords, but not necessarily catastrophic change. Many barbarian leaders were eager to maintain agricultural production. But for cities like Trier, Reims and Cologne, this rural occupation was a death sentence. Urban populations depended on food surpluses from the countryside. They depended on taxes collected from rural areas to pay for public services. They depended on rural markets to buy urban manufactured goods. When barbarian groups settled in the countryside and started operating outside the Roman economic system, cities began to starve, not literally, but economically. Think about it this way. If tomorrow all the farms around your city suddenly stopped participating in the modern economy, stopped paying taxes, stopped buying your city's products, how long would your urban infrastructure last? The psychological impact was equally devastating. Roman cities had always been symbols of civilization, order, and permanence. Citizens took pride in their public buildings, their civic institutions, their connection to the eternal empire. But as barbarian groups established their own kingdoms within former Roman territory, as Roman administration became increasingly unreliable, as trade networks fragmented, urban populations began to lose faith in the future. And here's something fascinating that archaeological evidence has revealed. In many cases, barbarian groups actually tried to preserve Roman urban infrastructure. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526 AD, spent enormous resources maintaining Roman aqueducts, repairing public buildings, and keeping urban institutions functioning. According to historian Cassiodorus, who served in Theodoric's administration, the king understood that cities were the source of wealth and power. But, and this is crucial, barbarian leaders faced an impossible challenge. Roman cities required Roman-level resources to maintain. The tax systems, trade networks, and administrative structures that had sustained urban life for centuries were incredibly complex and interdependent. Once those systems were disrupted, even well-intentioned barbarian kings couldn't put them back together. Imagine trying to maintain a modern city's infrastructure: water treatment plants, electrical grids, telecommunications networks, after the collapse of the federal government, the breakdown of international trade, and the fragmentation of the national economy. That's essentially what barbarian rulers were attempting when they tried to preserve Roman cities. Some succeeded for a while. Ravenna, under Ostrogothic rule, remained a magnificent city well into the 6th century. Toledo flourished as the capital of Visigothic Spain, but these were exceptions, and even they eventually succumbed to the broader trend of urban decline. The tragic irony is that many barbarian leaders genuinely admired Roman civilization and wanted to preserve it. They saw themselves not as destroyers but as inheritors of Roman greatness. But the very act of barbarian settlement, however peaceful, disrupted the delicate economic and administrative networks that Roman cities needed to survive. And here's the thing that keeps historians up at night. This process was largely irreversible. Once a Roman city lost its economic base, once its population dropped below the critical mass needed to maintain urban infrastructure, once its connection to imperial trade networks was severed, it became incredibly difficult to rebuild. Medieval Europe would eventually develop new forms of urban life, but it would take centuries, and the new cities would be fundamentally different from their Roman predecessors. But the barbarian invasions, devastating as they weren't the only force tearing apart the Roman urban world. Even as Germanic tribes were settling in former Roman territories, even as cities were losing their economic foundations, an even more fundamental crisis was developing, one that would strike at the very heart of the empire's ability to fund and maintain its vast urban civilization. Now imagine holding a Roman coin from the year 200 AD. Feel its weight in your palm, solid silver gleaming in the light. This denarius contains about 83% pure silver and represents real value that merchants from Britain to Syria would accept without question. Now picture the same silver coin from 270 AD, lighter, duller, containing barely 5% actual silver. In just 70 years, the Roman Empire had essentially destroyed its own money. And when your money dies, your cities die with it. This is the story of one of history's most catastrophic economic collapses, and it's about to show you how even the mightiest civilizations can crumble from within. Let me take you inside the imperial mint at Rome in the year 238 AD, where you would have witnessed something that would have shocked Marcus Aurelius himself. Workers are melting down perfectly good silver coins and mixing them with copper, tin and bronze. The finished silver denarii contain only 60% actual silver, a debasement that would have been considered treason just decades earlier. But Emperor Gordian III has no choice. The empire is broke, the armies demand pay, and there simply isn't enough silver left in the treasury. How did we get here? The answer lies in a vicious cycle that economist Michael Foldvary calls the classic imperial death spiral. It goes like this. Military expenses increase, taxes rise to cover costs, economic productivity decreases due to high taxation, tax revenues fall, so the government debases currency to make up the shortfall, which causes inflation, which increases military costs even more. Round and round it goes, until the whole system collapses. But let me show you the human cost of this economic catastrophe through the eyes of ordinary people. In Pompeiopolis, a mid-sized city in modern-day Turkey, archaeologist Dr. Clive Foss discovered something heartbreaking in the ruins. Hordes of coins buried in the walls of houses, hidden beneath floor tiles stuffed into pottery jars. These weren't the treasures of wealthy merchants. They were the life savings of ordinary citizens who watched helplessly as their money became worthless. One particular hoard, discovered in 1994, tells a devastating story. It contains 247 silver coins spanning from 180 AD to 250 AD. You can literally see the empire's economic collapse in these coins. The early ones are bright silver, well minted, clearly valuable. The later ones are increasingly debased, poorly made, desperately trying to maintain the appearance of value while containing almost no precious metal at all. Think about that for a moment. Imagine watching your life savings slowly become worthless, not through theft or disaster, but through your own government systematically destroying the value of money itself. The numbers behind this collapse are staggering. According to research by monetary historian Kevin Butcher from the University of Warwick, the silver content of Roman denarii fell from 83% under Marcus Aurelius to just 5% under Gallienus, a 94% devaluation in less than a century. To put that in modern terms, it would be like watching a $100 bill become worth $5 in your lifetime. But currency debasement was just the beginning. The real economic destruction came from what economists call Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good money. As Romans realized their new coins contained less silver, they started hoarding the old valuable coins and spending only the debased ones. This meant that good silver disappeared from circulation, while worthless metal flooded the markets. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman citizens had trusted their currency for centuries. Silver denarii had been the backbone of Mediterranean commerce since Augustus. Suddenly, merchants in Alexandria were refusing Roman coins, traders in Gaul were demanding payment in gold, and even local markets were reverting to barter systems. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like in everyday life. In 260 AD, a loaf of bread in Rome cost about half a denarius. By 280 AD, that same loaf cost 50 denarii. By 300 AD, it cost 200 denarii. Prices weren't just rising, they were exploding at rates that would make modern hyperinflation look mild. But here's where the story gets really tragic for Roman cities. Urban populations were completely dependent on the monetary economy. Unlike rural farmers who could grow their own food, city dwellers needed to buy everything with money. When that money became worthless, urban life became impossible. Take the city of Autumn in Gaul, for example. In 250 AD, it was a thriving commercial centre with over 40,000 residents. Archaeological evidence from Professor Pierre Pignon shows busy markets, active construction, and all the signs of urban prosperity. But as currency collapsed, trade networks broke down. Merchants stopped coming to the markets because Roman money wasn't worth the goods they were selling. Local craftsmen couldn't afford raw materials because prices were changing daily. Construction projects halted because workers demanded payment in food rather than increasingly worthless coins. By 280 AD, Autumn's population had fallen to fewer than 15,000 people. Large sections of the city were abandoned, not because of barbarian attacks or natural disasters, but because the economic foundation of urban life had simply evaporated. The government's response made everything worse. Instead of addressing the underlying fiscal problems, successive emperors doubled down on currency debasement. Aurelian introduced new bronze coins coated with silver, essentially counterfeiting his own money. Diocletian tried to fix prices by imperial decree, threatening death for anyone who charged more than official rates. But you can't solve inflation by making it illegal. any more than you can solve drought by outlawing thirst. And here's something that really shows the human cost: the disappearance of public inscriptions. For centuries, wealthy Romans had funded public buildings, festivals, and infrastructure projects, immortalizing their generosity in stone inscriptions. But as inflation destroyed wealth and made long-term planning impossible, these inscriptions virtually disappeared. According to epigraphist Dr. Russell Meigs, the number of public benefaction inscriptions drops by over 80% between 250 and 300 AD. What does that tell us? It means the wealthy Romans who had traditionally funded urban amenities, the baths, the theatres, the aqueducts, the festivals that made city life attractive, simply couldn't afford to anymore. When the rich become poor, who's going to maintain the fountains? But perhaps most devastating was the collapse of the professional army. Roman legions weren't just military units, they were economic engines that pumped money into frontier communities. A legion of 5,000 men represented an annual payroll of about 1.5 million denarii. That money supported not just soldiers, but their families, the merchants who sold them goods, the craftsmen who made their equipment, the farmers who fed them. Legionary bases were essentially small cities built around military spending. When currency debasement made military pay worthless, recruitment became impossible. Who wants to risk their life for money that won't buy dinner? The professional legions that had defended Rome for centuries began to disintegrate. In their place came barbarian federati, allied troops paid in land and goods rather than worthless coins. Do you see the vicious cycle forming? Economic collapse led to military weakness, which invited barbarian incursions, which increased military expenses, which required more currency debasement, which caused more economic collapse. The archaeological evidence for this economic catastrophe is overwhelming. Coin hoards buried during this period have been found across the empire, over 2,000 in Britain alone. These represent the life savings of ordinary people who lost faith in their government's money. Villa excavations show the sudden abandonment of luxury goods production. Urban archaeological layers from this period are thinner, showing reduced economic activity and smaller populations. But here's what makes this collapse so tragic. It was completely avoidable. The Roman Empire wasn't running out of silver. Spanish mines were still producing. The empire wasn't being overwhelmed by military expenses. Costs were manageable if spread across the tax base properly. The problem was political dysfunction. Emperors were being assassinated so frequently that long-term economic planning became impossible. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had 26 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths. Each new emperor faced the same impossible situation: empty treasury, unpaid armies, and political rivals ready to exploit any sign of weakness. The quick fix was always currency debasement. Print more money, worry about consequences later. But those consequences were the death of Roman urban civilization. And here's the thing that should terrify anyone living in a modern economy. Once hyperinflation destroys trust in money, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild. Even when Diocletian finally stabilized the currency in the early 300s, Roman cities never fully recovered. The middle class that had supported urban culture for centuries had been wiped out. The trade networks that had connected distant markets had fragmented. The economic confidence that had driven urban investment for generations was gone. But as devastating as this economic collapse was, it was about to intersect with an even more fundamental transformation, one that would completely redefine what Roman civilization meant and how people chose to live their lives. Here's something that might surprise you. While Roman cities were crumbling from economic collapse and barbarian settlements, the empire's road network was busier than ever, but the travellers weren't merchants carrying silk and spices. They were pilgrims heading to remote monasteries, carrying nothing but walking sticks and prayers. The same roads that had once connected a commercial empire were now leading people away from cities entirely. Welcome to one of history's most profound psychological revolutions, the moment when an entire civilization decided that urban life wasn't worth living anymore. Picture yourself in the year 380 AD, standing at a crossroads outside Milan, literally and figuratively. To your left, the road leads to the city centre, where you can still see the massive amphitheatre, the marble baths, the bustling forums that represent 1,000 years of Roman urban achievement. To your right, a dusty path winds toward the hills, where a new kind of community is taking root. Christian monasteries that deliberately reject everything the city represents. Which path would you choose? For an increasing number of Romans, the answer was becoming surprisingly clear. Let me tell you the story of Paulinus of Nola, because his journey perfectly captures this incredible transformation. Paulinus was everything a Roman was supposed to be. Wealthy, educated, politically connected, owner of vast estates across the empire. In 380 AD, he was living the Roman dream in a magnificent villa in Bordeaux, complete with marble floors, heated baths, and servants attending to his every need. Then, in 389 AD, he did something that shocked Roman high society. He gave it all away. Every villa, every estate, every luxury, sold, with the proceeds donated to the poor. He and his wife moved to a simple Christian community in Nola, Italy, where they spent their days in prayer, manual labour, and caring for pilgrims. The man who could have commanded armies chose instead to wash the feet of strangers. Was Paulinus crazy? Or was he responding to something profound that was happening to Roman civilization itself? According to historian Peter Brown's groundbreaking research, Paulinus wasn't alone. Across the empire, wealthy Romans were abandoning urban life in unprecedented numbers. They weren't fleeing to country estates for vacation. They were permanently rejecting the urban values that had defined Roman civilization for centuries. Think about what this meant. For 1,000 years, Romans had believed that civilization meant cities. Barbarians lived in forests and fields. Civilized people lived in marble-paved urban centres with theatres, baths and forums. But suddenly, the most admired figures in Roman society were hermits living in caves, monks sleeping on straw mats, and holy women who deliberately chose poverty over prosperity. The numbers tell an incredible story. According to research by monastery historian Marilyn Dunn, the number of Christian monasteries in Gaul alone grew from fewer than 20 in 350 AD to over 200 by 450 AD. Each monastery represented not just a religious community, but an alternative vision of how human society could be organized. Instead of competitive urban hierarchies, monasteries offered egalitarian communities. Instead of material accumulation, they promoted spiritual wealth. Instead of individual achievement, they emphasized collective purpose. But here's what makes this transformation so fascinating. It wasn't just about religion. It was about a fundamental shift in what Romans thought made life worth living. Let me take you inside the monastery of Lerins, founded around 400 AD on a small island off the coast of southern France. The founder, Honoratus, was another wealthy Roman who had abandoned urban life. But Lerins wasn't a primitive retreat from civilization. It was a sophisticated community that offered everything a Roman city provided, just organized around completely different principles. The monastery had workshops for crafts and manuscript copying, libraries that preserved classical texts, schools that educated the children of both monks and local families, hospitals that cared for the sick, and guest houses that welcomed travellers. According to the life of St. Honoratus, written by his successor Hilary, the community was economically self-sufficient, intellectually vibrant, and socially diverse. It was essentially a city, but a city built on cooperation rather than competition, spiritual rather than material wealth. And here's the crucial point. People were choosing this life not because they were forced to, but because urban life had lost its appeal. Roman cities in the 4th and 5th centuries were increasingly violent, economically unstable, and socially divided. The public amenities that had made urban life attractive, the baths, theatres, forums, were either deteriorating or becoming too expensive for ordinary citizens to enjoy. Meanwhile, Christian communities offered something that traditional Roman society couldn't: security, purpose, and genuine equality. Genuine. In a world where imperial politics were deadly, barbarian raids were frequent, and economic collapse was constant, the monastery began to look less like an escape from civilization and more like its logical evolution. The psychological impact of this shift was enormous. For centuries, Romans had derived their identity from their connection to urban institutions, their membership in guilds, their participation in civic festivals, their attendance at gladiatorial games, their patronage of public buildings. But Christianity offered a completely different source of identity: membership in the community of the faithful, participation in eternal rather than temporal affairs, and service to God rather than Caesar. This wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a cognitive revolution. Romans were literally rewiring their brains to value different things, seek different goals, and organize their lives around different principles. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out. In 407 AD, the city of Trier, that magnificent Rome of the North we explored earlier, faced a crisis. Barbarian raids had disrupted the surrounding countryside, trade had declined, and the imperial court had moved to Ravenna. The traditional Roman response would have been to strengthen the walls, raise taxes, and recruit more soldiers. Instead, something unprecedented happened. According to the Chronicle of Hydatius, a significant portion of Trier's population simply left. They didn't flee in panic. They made deliberate decisions to join Christian communities in rural areas. Wealthy families donated their urban properties to the church and moved to monastery-supported agricultural settlements. Craftsmen closed their city workshops and joined religious communities where their skills were used for spiritual rather than commercial purposes. By 420 AD, Trier's population had dropped from 80,000 to fewer than 20,000 people. But here's the fascinating part. Many of the people who left weren't economic refugees. They were spiritual pioneers who had concluded that urban life was spiritually bankrupt. This pattern repeated across the empire. Antioch, once a glittering metropolis of 300,000 people, saw massive population outflows to surrounding monasteries. Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, lost many of its best minds to Christian schools in the Egyptian desert. Even Rome itself experienced what historian Chris Wickham calls voluntary deurbanization, as wealthy Christians chose ascetic lifestyles over urban luxury. But perhaps most significantly, this movement was changing how Romans thought about infrastructure and public space. Traditional Roman cities had been built around public amenities funded by wealthy citizens seeking social status. But Christianity taught that true honor came from helping the poor, not impressing the powerful. So instead of funding new amphitheatres or bathhouses, wealthy Christians began funding hospitals, orphanages, and pilgrim hostels. Instead of competitive public displays, they organized cooperative charitable works. The urban landscape itself began to reflect these new values. Churches replaced temples, hospices replaced gymnasiums, and monastery gardens replaced ornamental forums. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to live through such a fundamental transformation in social values? To watch an entire civilization decide that everything their ancestors had built was somehow wrong? The archaeological evidence for this transformation is striking. Excavations across the former empire show the same pattern. Traditional Roman public buildings falling into disrepair, while Christian structures receive new investment. Villa sites show evidence of conversion to religious use. Urban workshops close while monastery scriptorias expand their operations. But here's what makes this story so poignant. The Romans who chose monastic life weren't rejecting civilization. They were trying to save it. In their view, traditional Roman cities had become morally corrupt, economically predatory, and spiritually empty. Monasteries represented an attempt to preserve what was best about Roman culture: learning, law, technological skill, administrative competence, while discarding what had become toxic. And in many ways, they succeeded. When urban life collapsed across Western Europe, it was often monasteries that preserved classical texts, maintained agricultural techniques, and provided the social services that governments could no longer deliver. But this spiritual revolution was about to collide with an even more fundamental challenge to Roman urban life, one that would literally reshape the physical landscape of Europe and make the old Roman world impossible to sustain. There's something absolutely mind-blowing that most people don't realize about Roman roads. They weren't just transportation networks. They were the arteries of civilization itself. When those arteries started to harden and clog, the entire body of Roman urban life began to die. And the story of how the world's greatest road system became unusable is one of the most fascinating examples of how infrastructure collapse can doom an entire civilization. Imagine standing on the Via Appia in the year 200 AD, that magnificent highway connecting Rome to the port of Brindisi, 350 miles to the southeast. You'd see a river of activity, merchant caravans loaded with eastern spices, imperial messengers racing between way stations, wealthy Romans travelling in comfortable carriages, soldiers marching in perfect formation, and ordinary citizens making pilgrimages to distant shrines. Now picture that same road in 450 AD. The beautiful stone pavement is cracked and overgrown with weeds. Bridges have collapsed into rivers below. Way stations stand empty and crumbling. What was once the empire's main commercial artery has become a dangerous path used only by desperate travellers and bands of brigands. How did this happen? How does the world's most sophisticated transportation network simply disappear? The answer reveals something profound about how civilizations depend on maintenance systems that most people never think about until they're gone. Let me take you behind the scenes of Roman road maintenance, because understanding this system will help you appreciate just how catastrophic its collapse really was. Roman roads weren't just built and forgotten. They required constant, sophisticated upkeep that employed thousands of people across the empire. Every major road had a curator viarum, essentially a highway superintendent responsible for maintaining a specific section. These weren't just ceremonial positions. They were complex engineering jobs that required understanding drainage, stone cutting, bridge construction, and traffic management. According to inscriptional evidence collected by Professor Raymond Chevalier, a single curator might supervise hundreds of workers, stonemasons, carpenters, metal workers, and specialized teams for different types of repairs. The economics were staggering. Research by transportation historian Anne Kolb suggests that maintaining the Roman road network cost approximately 2% of the empire's total annual revenue, roughly equivalent to what modern countries spend on highway maintenance today. But here's the crucial difference. Roman roads were built to last centuries, not decades like modern highways. The famous Roman saying, "All roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a metaphor. It was a precise description of how the transportation network was funded and organized. Provincial taxes flowed to Rome, which then allocated resources for road maintenance across the empire. Local communities were responsible for minor repairs, but major reconstruction projects were funded and supervised by imperial engineers. But as we've seen, that whole system was falling apart by the 4th century. Barbarian settlements disrupted tax collection. Economic collapse reduced available revenue. Political instability made long-term infrastructure planning impossible. And here's where the road story gets really tragic. Once Roman road maintenance stopped, the roads deteriorated incredibly quickly. Let me show you exactly how this happened using the Via Domitia, the great highway connecting Italy to Spain through southern Gaul. Built in 118 BC, this road had served the empire faithfully for over 400 years. Archaeological investigations by Dr. Pierre Cillière show that the road was in excellent condition as late as 350 AD, with evidence of recent repairs and active traffic. But then, maintenance stopped. Without regular cleaning, drainage ditches filled with debris, causing water to pool on the road surface. Without stone replacement, heavy wagon traffic created ruts and cracks. Without bridge repairs, winter floods washed away supports, making river crossings impassable. By 450 AD, large sections of the Via Domitia were completely unusable. Can you imagine trying to maintain your local highway system without government funding, professional engineers, or organized labor? That's essentially what happened to the Roman road network. The human cost was enormous. Roman cities had been designed around the assumption of reliable, fast transportation. Urban populations depended on food shipments from distant agricultural regions. Craftsmen relied on raw materials from specialized suppliers hundreds of miles away. Merchants needed predictable travel times to make profitable trades. When roads became unreliable, all of these urban systems began to fail. Let me give you a specific example from Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, France. This city had thrived as a transportation hub where roads from Britain, Germany, Spain and Italy converged. Merchants would arrive from across the empire, exchange goods, and redistribute them to their final destinations. But as road conditions deteriorated, long-distance merchants stopped coming to Lugdunum. Why risk valuable cargo on dangerous, unpredictable routes? Instead, trade patterns fragmented into smaller local networks. According to archaeological evidence analysed by Professor Armand Desbat, the city's famous pottery workshops, which had exported their products across Gaul, suddenly stopped production around 420 AD, not because demand disappeared, but because transportation had become too unreliable. Lugdunum's population, which had peaked at over 50,000 people, dropped to fewer than 10,000 by 500 AD. The city didn't die from war or disease, it died from transportation failure. And here's something that really shows the psychological impact of this collapse: the disappearance of milestones. Roman roads had been marked every Roman mile, about 9 modern miles, with stone markers indicating distances to major cities. These milestones weren't just practical, they were symbols of imperial power and territorial control. But as road maintenance ceased, new milestones stopped being erected. Existing ones were often removed and used as building materials for local construction projects. The archaeological record shows a dramatic decline in milestone production after 350 AD. It's as if the empire was literally losing track of where it was going. The collapse of Roman roads also had devastating effects on information flow. The imperial postal system, the cursus publicus, had been one of the ancient world's most sophisticated communication networks. Imperial messengers could carry urgent dispatches from York to Rome in just 40 days. a speed that wouldn't be matched again in Europe until the 1700s. But this system depended entirely on well-maintained roads and strategically placed way stations. As roads deteriorated and stations were abandoned, communication times increased dramatically. According to historian Michael McCormick's research, a message that took 40 days to travel in 250 AD might take 80 or 100 days by 450 AD, if it arrived at all. Think about what this meant for government administration. How do you run an empire when orders from the capital take months to reach provincial governors? How do you coordinate military responses when generals can't communicate with each other? How do you collect taxes when you can't reliably send collectors to remote areas? The road collapse also transformed European geography in ways that are still visible today. Roman roads had connected regions that made economic sense, but weren't necessarily geographically obvious. The Great Highway from Cologne to Milan, for example, crossed the Alps through carefully engineered passes that made year-round travel possible. But when these mountain roads became unmaintained, Alpine passes became impassable during winter months. Trade routes that had connected northern and southern Europe for centuries simply disappeared. Regional economies that had been integrated for hundreds of years suddenly became isolated. Europe began to fragment into the smaller, more localized units that would characterize medieval geography. Perhaps most tragically, the knowledge of Roman road building itself was largely lost. These weren't just construction techniques. They were sophisticated engineering systems that had taken centuries to develop and perfect. When the institutional framework for maintaining roads collapsed, the expertise went with it. Medieval European roads wouldn't match Roman engineering standards until the 1700s. The techniques for building roads that could carry heavy traffic for centuries without major maintenance wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern era. In some ways, Europe didn't recover from the Roman road collapse until the invention of railroads. But the collapse of the road system was just one part of a larger infrastructure crisis that was making Roman cities impossible to maintain. While engineers struggled to keep highways passable, an even more fundamental challenge was emerging, one that would strike at the very foundation of urban life. Just when you thought the story couldn't get more devastating, along comes something that makes barbarian invasions look like a minor inconvenience. It was invisible, unstoppable, and it killed more Romans than all the Germanic tribes combined. But this wasn't a human enemy. It was a microscopic one, and when the plague of Justinian swept across the Mediterranean world in 541 AD, it didn't just kill people, it killed the very idea that cities were safe places to live. Let me paint you a picture that will absolutely chill you to the bone. Imagine walking through Constantinople in the summer of 542 AD, the greatest city in what remained of the Roman world, home to over 500,000 people, the crown jewel of Byzantine civilization. The morning starts normally enough. Merchants setting up their stalls, children playing in the streets, the magnificent Hagia Sophia gleaming in the morning sun. But by midday, something's wrong. People are collapsing in the markets. Bodies are being carried out of houses. By evening, the city that had buzzed with life for over 200 years sounds like a tomb. The only sounds are the creaking of death carts and the wailing of survivors. According to the historian Procopius, who witnessed this catastrophe firsthand, Constantinople was losing 10,000 people per day at the plague's peak. That's not a typo. 10,000 people every single day. In a city of 500,000, that meant 1 in 50 residents was dying daily. Can you even imagine such horror? But here's what makes this plague so significant for our story. It wasn't just killing people randomly. It was systematically destroying the foundations of urban life itself. And the way it spread reveals something terrifying about how interconnected the Roman world had become, and how that interconnectedness could become a death sentence. the plague arrived in Constantinople aboard grain ships from Egypt, carried by fleas that lived on black rats that thrived in ship holds. This wasn't unusual. Constantinople imported about 175,000 tons of grain annually from Egypt to feed its massive population. The same trade networks that had made Roman cities prosperous were now delivering death door to door. Let me take you inside the mind of someone living through this nightmare. Meet Evagrius Scholasticus, a lawyer in Antioch who survived the plague and left us a detailed account. He describes watching his wife, his daughter, his grandchildren, and most of his friends die within a matter of weeks. But what really comes through in his writing isn't just personal grief. It's the complete breakdown of everything that made urban life function. Courts closed because there weren't enough judges left alive. Markets shut down because merchants were either dead or had fled to the countryside. Construction projects halted because entire guilds of craftsmen had been wiped out. According to Evagrius, the city government essentially stopped functioning because most officials had either died or abandoned their posts. And here's the terrifying math behind this catastrophe. Modern epidemiologists, led by researchers like Dr. Lester Little from Smith College, estimate that the plague of Justinian killed between 25 and 40% of the population in affected areas. That's not just a health crisis. That's a demographic apocalypse that makes modern pandemics look mild by comparison. But the real tragedy wasn't just the immediate death toll. It was how the plague permanently changed people's relationship with cities. For over 1,000 years, Romans had believed that urban life was safer than rural life. Cities had walls to keep out enemies, granaries to survive famines, and doctors to treat the sick. But the plague revealed that dense urban populations were actually more vulnerable to certain disasters than scattered rural communities. Think about it. If you're a peasant living on an isolated farm when plague hits the nearest city, you might survive simply because you're too far from other people to catch the disease. But if you're living in a Roman apartment building with hundreds of neighbours sharing common spaces, you're essentially trapped in a death zone. The psychological impact was enormous. Professor Kyle Harper from the University of Oklahoma has analysed the literary sources from this period, and they show a complete transformation in how people thought about urban life. Before the plague, cities were seen as monuments to human achievement. After the plague, they were often viewed as dangerous concentrations of sin and suffering that invited divine punishment. This fear wasn't irrational. It was based on harsh experience. The plague didn't just hit once and disappear. It returned in waves every 8-12 years for the next 2 centuries, always hitting urban areas hardest. Constantinople alone suffered major plague outbreaks in 5442, 558, 573, 586, 599, 618, 698, and 747 AD. That's 8 major demographic disasters in 2 centuries. Can you imagine trying to maintain urban institutions under those conditions? How do you plan long-term construction projects when you don't know if your population will be cut in half next decade? How do you maintain complex craft guilds when entire trades might be wiped out overnight? How do you justify living in a city when the countryside seems so much safer? Let me show you exactly how this played out using the city of Carthage in North Africa. Before the plague, Carthage was one of the Mediterranean's greatest cities, with over 100,000 residents, magnificent public buildings, and a thriving economy based on African grain exports. Archaeological evidence from Dr. Susan Stevens' excavations shows a bustling urban centre with active construction, busy markets, and all the signs of urban vitality. Then the plague hit in 542 AD. Contemporary sources suggest that Carthage lost about 40% of its population in the first outbreak alone. But here's what's really devastating. The city never recovered. Subsequent plague waves in 558, 573, and 599 AD prevented any sustained population growth. By 650 AD, when the Arabs conquered North Africa, Carthage had fewer than 20,000 residents, an 80% population decline from its pre-plague peak. The economic consequences were equally catastrophic. Roman cities had depended on having enough people to support specialized crafts, professional services, and complex trade networks. When plague reduced urban populations below critical thresholds, entire economic sectors simply vanished. Take glassmaking, for example. Roman cities had supported sophisticated glass industries that produced everything from window panes to delicate artistic pieces. But glassmaking required specialized knowledge passed down through family workshops over generations. When plague wiped out entire families of craftsmen, that knowledge disappeared with them. Archaeological evidence from glass workshops across the former empire shows the same pattern. Active production until the mid-6th century, then sudden abandonment that lasted for centuries. Europe wouldn't recover Roman-level glassmaking capabilities until the High Middle Ages, over 500 years later. The same thing happened with urban services that required trained professionals. Roman cities had supported schools, hospitals, libraries, and public entertainment venues staffed by educated specialists. But when plague killed teachers, doctors, librarians, and performers faster than they could be replaced, these institutions simply closed. Perhaps most tragically, the plague destroyed the demographic foundation that had made Roman urban culture possible. Roman cities had always attracted young people from rural areas, seeking opportunities, education, and advancement. This constant influx of rural migrants had maintained urban populations despite high mortality rates from disease and violence. But the plague made cities seem like death traps rather than opportunity centers. Why would a healthy young person leave a safe rural village to seek their fortune in an urban area where plague might kill them within months of arrival? The Great Migration from countryside to city that had sustained Roman urban civilization for centuries simply stopped. Professor Peter Saris from Cambridge has calculated that urban populations across the former Roman Empire didn't return to pre-plague levels until the 11th century, over 500 years later. That's 5 centuries during which European cities remained demographic shadows of their former selves. But the plague's impact went beyond just reducing urban populations. It fundamentally changed how survivors thought about risk, planning, and the future. Roman urban culture had been built on confidence in human progress, technological advancement, and institutional continuity. The plague shattered that confidence and replaced it with a much more fatalistic worldview. Religious sources from the post-plague period show a dramatic shift toward apocalyptic thinking. Instead of building for eternity like their ancestors, survivors focused on preparing for the end of the world. Instead of investing in urban infrastructure, they donated to churches and monasteries. Instead of pursuing worldly success, they sought spiritual salvation. Do you see how this connects to the Christian transformation we discussed earlier? The plague didn't just kill people. It killed optimism about earthly life and made otherworldly alternatives seem more attractive. But even as Mediterranean cities struggled to survive repeated plague outbreaks, even as urban populations declined and institutions collapsed, new forces were emerging that would completely reshape the political and economic landscape of the former Roman world. But wait, there's a plot twist coming that nobody saw. While Roman cities were dying from plague, economic collapse, and barbarian settlements, something remarkable was happening in the countryside. A completely new form of social organization was emerging, one that would make cities seem almost irrelevant. It was called feudalism, and it represented perhaps the most radical transformation in how human societies organize power that Europe had ever seen. Picture this. It's the year 480 AD. and you're a successful merchant in the declining city of Bordeaux. Your grandfather had made a fortune importing Spanish olive oil and British wool. Your father had managed to maintain the family business despite barbarian raids and currency debasement. But now you're facing an impossible choice that would have been unthinkable to your ancestors. A local Visigothic lord named Uric has made you an offer. He'll protect your family and property from bandits, provide security for your trade routes, and guarantee your access to agricultural products from his estates. In exchange, you just need to do one small thing. Abandon your urban lifestyle, move to his rural stronghold, and swear personal loyalty to him rather than to some distant emperor who can't even protect his own capital. What would you do? For an increasing number of Romans, the answer was becoming clear. Take the deal. This is the story of how Europe accidentally invented a completely new way of organizing society, one that made Roman-style cities obsolete for over 500 years. Let me explain what feudalism actually was, because it's one of the most misunderstood concepts in history. Feudalism wasn't a deliberate political system that someone designed. It was an emergency response to the collapse of centralized authority, a practical solution to the problem of how to organize society when governments can no longer provide basic services like security, justice, and economic coordination. Here's how it worked in practice. Instead of depending on distant imperial institutions, people formed personal relationships with local strongmen who had the military power to protect them. These weren't just business contracts, they were sacred oaths that created new kinds of social bonds. A lord would provide land, protection, and justice to his followers, called vassals. In exchange, vassals would provide military service, agricultural labor, and absolute loyalty to their lord. The genius of this system was its flexibility. Unlike Roman institutions, which required massive bureaucracies, standing armies, and complex supply chains to function, feudal relationships could work at any scale. A single village could have its own protective arrangements. A rural valley could become a self-sufficient political unit. You didn't need cities, roads, or imperial administration to make feudalism work. Let me show you exactly how this transformation played out using the story of Gaul in the 5th and 6th centuries, according to research by historian Chris Wickham from Oxford. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic shift in settlement patterns during this period. Roman villa sites, those magnificent country estates that had housed the rural elite, were either abandoned or converted into fortified strongholds surrounded by peasant villages. But here's what's really fascinating. This wasn't economic decline. In many cases, agricultural production actually increased under feudal organization. Why? Because feudal lords had strong personal incentives to maximize the productivity of their lands, unlike distant Roman landowners who might never visit their estates. Take the case of Gregory of Tours, a 6th century bishop who left us detailed descriptions of life in post-Roman Gaul. Gregory describes visiting the estate of a Frankish lord named Rausching, who had transformed a former Roman villa into the center of a thriving agricultural community. The estate produced grain, wine, textiles, metalwork, and pottery, essentially everything its inhabitants needed to live comfortably without relying on urban markets. Can you see the revolutionary implications? For the first time in centuries, Europeans were proving that you could have prosperity, security, and even sophisticated culture without depending on cities at all. The social psychology behind this transformation was profound. Roman civilization had been built on the idea that status came from participation in urban institutions, holding political office, patronizing public buildings, attending civic festivals, competing for social recognition in the forum. But feudalism created a completely different status system based on personal relationships and rural landholding. A feudal lord derived his power not from votes or imperial appointments, but from the number of warriors who had sworn personal loyalty to him. His wealth came not from urban rents or commercial profits, but from agricultural production on his own lands. His status came not from civic achievements, but from his reputation for protecting his followers and keeping his word. This wasn't just a different political system. It was a different way of being human in society. Let me give you a specific example of how this played out. In 507 AD, the Frankish king Clovis defeated the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse at the Battle of Vouillers, but instead of occupying Toulouse and trying to run it as a Roman-style city, Clovis did something unprecedented. He distributed the surrounding countryside among his Frankish warriors as personal fiefs. According to the Chronicle of Fredegar, each warrior received enough land to support himself, his family and a small group of armed followers. They built fortified farmhouses, recruited local peasants as labourers, and created self-sufficient agricultural communities that had no need for urban services. Within a generation, Toulouse had lost most of its commercial function. The city didn't disappear entirely, it remained an important religious centre. But its role as an economic hub was essentially finished. Why travel to a dangerous, expensive city to buy goods when you could produce everything you needed on your own estate? The archaeological evidence for this transformation is striking. Excavations in rural areas across former Roman territories show the same pattern. The construction of new fortified sites, often called motte and bailey castles, surrounded by agricultural settlements. These weren't temporary camps. They were permanent alternatives to urban civilization. Professor Thomas Bisson from Harvard has calculated that over 10,000 of these feudal strongholds were built across Western Europe between 450 and 750 AD. Each one represented a conscious decision to opt out of the Roman urban system and create something completely different. But perhaps most importantly, feudalism was changing how Europeans thought about power itself. Roman power had been institutional. Emperors derived authority from their position in a complex governmental hierarchy. But feudal power was personal. Lords commanded obedience because of individual relationships based on oath-taking and mutual obligation. This had enormous implications for how society was organized. Roman cities had been administered by professional bureaucrats who implemented imperial policies across vast territories. But feudal territories were governed by personal negotiation between lords and vassals who knew each other face to face. The economic implications were equally revolutionary. Roman trade had depended on specialized production, long-distance transportation, and monetary exchange. But feudal estates aimed for self-sufficiency, local production, and payment in goods and services rather than money. Think about what this meant for urban artisans. Why would a feudal lord hire expensive city craftsmen when he could train his own peasants to produce everything his community needed? Why would he buy goods in urban markets when his own estates could supply food, textiles, tools, and weapons? The result was what historian Henri Pirenne called the closed economy, regional systems that provided for their own needs without depending on external trade. It was the exact opposite of the integrated, interdependent economy that had sustained Roman cities. And here's something that really shows how complete this transformation was. The disappearance of Roman coinage in many areas. Feudal communities often operated without money entirely, using barter systems and payment in kind. Archaeological sites from this period show dramatic reductions in coin finds, not because people were poorer, but because they simply didn't need money anymore. By 600 AD, large areas of Western Europe had essentially reverted to pre-Roman social organization. Small-scale agricultural communities led by warrior elites, with minimal dependence on urban centres or long-distance trade. It was as if 1,000 years of Roman urban civilization had been reset. But this feudal revolution was about to collide with yet another force that would reshape the Mediterranean world and deal a final blow to the remnants of Roman urban culture. Because while European lords were building their rural strongholds, a new empire was rising in the east, one that would completely reorganize the trade networks that had sustained Roman cities for over a millennium. Everything changed on a scorching day in 622 AD, when a merchant named Muhammad left the city of Mecca and began a journey that would completely reshape the world's economic geography. But here's what most people don't realize. The rise of Islam didn't just conquer territories, it fundamentally rewired the trade networks that had sustained Roman cities for over 1,000 years. And when those trade routes shifted, the last lifelines connecting Europe's struggling urban centres to the wider world were suddenly cut. Imagine you're a Byzantine merchant in Alexandria in the year 640 AD, watching Arab armies approach your city's walls. You might think this is just another barbarian invasion, like the Germanic tribes that had been disrupting the empire for centuries. But you'd be completely wrong. These aren't raiders looking for quick plunder. They're the advance guard of a new civilization that's about to revolutionize how the entire Mediterranean world does business. Within just 1 century of Muhammad's death, Islamic armies had conquered an area stretching from Spain to India. But unlike previous conquerors who simply looted and left, the Arabs created something unprecedented. A unified commercial empire that connected 3 continents under a single religious, legal and economic system. Here's where this gets fascinating for our story about urban decline. The Islamic conquest didn't destroy Mediterranean trade, they redirected it. And that redirection was absolutely catastrophic for the remaining Roman cities in Western Europe. Let me show you exactly how this worked using the papyrus trade as an example. For over 1,000 years, papyrus from Egypt had been the writing material of choice throughout the Roman world. European monasteries, royal chancelleries, and merchant houses all depended on regular shipments of Egyptian papyrus to keep their records and conduct their business. But when Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 AD, they didn't stop papyrus production, they reorganized it. According to research by papyrologist Roger Bagnall from New York University, Egyptian papyrus production actually increased under early Islamic rule. But here's the crucial change. Instead of shipping papyrus north to European markets, Egyptian producers began sending it east to Baghdad, Damascus, and the growing cities of the Islamic world. The result? European institutions that had used papyrus for centuries suddenly couldn't get it anymore. They were forced to switch to parchment made from animal skins, a much more expensive alternative that could cost 10 times as much as papyrus. For struggling European monasteries and towns already dealing with economic hardship, this price increase was devastating. But papyrus was just one example of a much larger pattern. The Islamic conquest didn't just change who controlled Mediterranean territories, they completely restructured the economic relationships that had connected different regions for centuries. Take the spice trade, which had been one of the foundations of Roman commercial wealth. For centuries, European merchants had imported pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and other exotic spices from India and Southeast Asia through a complex network of trading posts and middlemen. These spices weren't just luxuries, they were essential for food preservation, medicine, and religious ceremonies. But Islamic expansion created new, more direct trade routes between the Middle East and Asia. Arab merchants established trading posts in Indian Ocean ports, developed new commercial relationships with Indian producers, and created credit systems that made long-distance trade more efficient than ever before. The result was what economic historian Michael McCormick calls the Great Commercial Reorientation. Instead of flowing north through the Mediterranean to European markets, Asian goods began flowing east through the Red Sea to Cairo, then overland to Damascus and Baghdad, and finally to the growing Islamic cities of Central Asia and Spain. European cities that had thrived on importing and redistributing Asian goods suddenly found themselves cut out of the loop entirely. Why would an Indian pepper merchant sell to struggling European towns when thriving Islamic cities offered better prices, more reliable payment, and safer transportation? Let me give you a specific example of how devastating this could be. The city of Marseille had been one of the Mediterranean's great trading ports for over 600 years. Ships from across the empire docked there to load wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods for export to distant markets. In return, Marseille had imported luxury items from Asia, Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. But archaeological evidence from Professor Michel Bonifay's excavations shows that long-distance trade through Marseille essentially collapsed in the 7th century. Pottery sherds from distant regions, which had been common in earlier archaeological layers, virtually disappear. Construction activity decreases dramatically. The city's population, which may have reached 50,000 at its peak, probably dropped to fewer than 5,000 by 700 AD. Marseille didn't disappear entirely. It remained a regional fishing port, but its role as an international commercial hub was finished. The economic foundation that had supported urban life there for centuries had simply vanished. And here's what makes this story so poignant. The Islamic world was experiencing an urban boom at exactly the same time that European cities were declining. Baghdad, founded in 762 AD, grew to over 500,000 people within a century, making it larger than Rome had been at its peak. Cairo, Damascus, Cordoba, and Palermo all flourished as major commercial and intellectual centers. These weren't just big towns. They were sophisticated urban environments with features that European cities wouldn't match for centuries. Baghdad had hospitals with medical schools, libraries containing hundreds of thousands of books, public baths supplied by advanced hydraulic systems, and markets selling goods from China to Spain. Can you imagine the psychological impact on European Christians? For 1,000 years they had considered themselves the heirs to the world's most advanced civilization. But suddenly, the most magnificent cities, the most sophisticated technologies, and the most extensive trade networks were all controlled by followers of a religion that hadn't even existed 2 centuries earlier. The commercial reorientation also had profound effects on what goods were available in European markets. Many products that had been common in Roman cities, silk from China, spices from India, papyrus from Egypt, precious stones from Ceylon, became incredibly rare and expensive in post-Islamic Europe. This scarcity forced European communities to become even more self-sufficient, which further reduced the economic advantages of urban life. If you can't buy exotic goods in the city anyway, why not live in the countryside where you can at least produce your own food and basic necessities? But perhaps most significantly, the Islamic conquest changed the entire scale of commercial operations. Roman trade had been organized around individual merchants or small partnerships, conducting business across relatively short distances. But Islamic commerce was organized around vast trading networks spanning continents, supported by sophisticated banking systems and backed by unified imperial authority. European merchants simply couldn't compete with this new scale of operation. A European trader might spend months organizing a single shipment of goods to a neighboring region. Meanwhile, Islamic merchants were coordinating trade expeditions that could take years to complete and involve dozens of partners across multiple continents. The technological gap was equally daunting. Islamic navigators had access to new mathematical instruments, advanced map-making techniques, and navigational knowledge inherited from Indian and Chinese sources, Islamic merchants used sophisticated credit systems, standardized weights and measures, and commercial law codes that made long-distance trade safer and more profitable. European commercial practices, which had seemed advanced in the 4th century, now looked primitive by comparison. It was like trying to compete with modern multinational corporations using medieval guild structures. This commercial revolution also explains why some European regions declined faster than others. Areas that had depended heavily on Mediterranean trade, like southern Italy, southern France, and eastern Spain, experienced rapid urban decline as their economic foundations disappeared. But regions that had been more focused on local or northern European trade, like northern France, Germany, and Britain, managed to maintain modest urban centres for longer periods. The shift also helps explain why certain types of cities survived better than others. Religious centres like Rome, Canterbury, and Tours maintained their populations because they provided spiritual services that couldn't be imported from Islamic territories. Administrative centres like Paris and London survived because feudal kingdoms still needed governmental functions. But purely commercial cities that had existed primarily to facilitate trade often withered away entirely. By 750 AD, the economic map of Europe had been completely redrawn. The vibrant, interconnected urban network that had characterized the Roman Mediterranean was gone, replaced by isolated regional economies with minimal long-distance connections. Europe hadn't just lost its cities, it had lost its place in the world economy. But even as European urban life seemed to be reaching its absolute lowest point, even as cities across the continent shrank to mere shadows of their former selves, some extraordinary communities were refusing to give up. Against all odds, a few remarkable places were discovering that the secret to urban survival might be reinventing what cities were for. Against all odds, some cities refused to die, and their survival stories are absolutely fascinating because they reveal the secret ingredients that could keep urban life alive even when everything seemed hopeless. These weren't the biggest or richest cities, they were the smartest ones, the most adaptable ones, the ones that figured out how to reinvent themselves when the old Roman world collapsed around them. Let me tell you about 3 remarkable survival stories that will completely change how you think about resilience and adaptation. First, there's Rome itself, the eternal city that somehow managed to stay eternal, even when everything about it should have spelled doom. By 550 AD, Rome had lost over 90% of its population, falling from over 1 million residents to perhaps 50,000 people, rattling around in a city built for 20 times that many. The aqueducts were broken, the forums were abandoned, and wild animals literally roamed through the ruins of the Colosseum. But here's what's amazing. Rome didn't just survive, it transformed itself into something completely new. Instead of trying to maintain its impossible imperial infrastructure, the city reinvented itself around a different kind of power. Spiritual authority. Pope Gregory the Great, who ruled from 590 to 604 AD, essentially turned Rome into the world's first religious tourism destination. Instead of attracting merchants and administrators, Rome began attracting pilgrims. Instead of importing grain from Egypt to feed a massive population, the city developed a sustainable economy based on hosting visitors who came to pray at Christian shrines. According to research by historian Chris Wickham, Gregory reorganized the city's entire economy around what we'd recognize today as the service industry. Roman churches were converted into hostels for pilgrims. Abandoned public buildings became workshops for producing religious souvenirs. Former commercial districts were transformed into religious complexes with chapels, libraries and scriptoriums. The genius of this transformation was that it created a sustainable urban economy that didn't depend on the complex systems that had failed everywhere else. Pilgrims brought their own money, stayed for short periods, and didn't require massive infrastructure investments. Rome had essentially invented the world's first tourism-based city. Can you imagine the psychological shift this required? Romans had to completely reimagine what their city was for, not the centre of a political empire, but the spiritual heart of a new religious community. Now let's travel north to Constantinople, which faced an even more impossible challenge. The city was surrounded by enemies, devastated by plague, and cut off from most of its traditional trade networks. By all logic, it should have collapsed like every other major Roman city. Instead, Constantinople became one of the medieval world's greatest success stories. How? By mastering the art of technological innovation and diplomatic flexibility. Emperor Leo III, who ruled from 717 to 741 AD, transformed Constantinople into what we might call today a knowledge economy. Instead of depending on vast territorial control, the city became a centre for preserving, translating, and developing new technologies. Byzantine scholars collected manuscripts from across the known world, translated works from Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew, and created the medieval world's most sophisticated educational institutions. But here's what really made Constantinople special. It became a master of niche markets. While Islamic cities controlled the mainstream spice and silk trades, Constantinople specialized in luxury goods that required unique expertise. Byzantine craftsmen became famous for producing silk textiles so fine that Islamic rulers would pay enormous sums to acquire them. Constantinople's goldsmiths created jewellery and religious artifacts that were prized from Ireland to India. According to economic historian Michael Hendy's analysis of Byzantine coin distributions, Constantinople maintained trade relationships with over 40 different regions, despite controlling relatively little territory. The city had essentially become a high-value-added manufacturing centre that could compete with much larger economies by focusing on quality rather than quantity. Think about the strategic brilliance of this approach. Instead of trying to recreate the Roman Empire's vast territorial control, Constantinople built an economy based on irreplaceable expertise. Other cities could produce grain, olive oil, or basic manufactured goods, but only Constantinople could produce certain types of luxury items that wealthy customers across 3 continents desired. But perhaps the most remarkable survival story comes from an entirely unexpected place. Ravenna, a small Italian city that managed to thrive for over 200 years under barbarian rule by completely reimagining what urban governance could look like. When the Ostrogothic king Theodoric made Ravenna his capital in 493 AD, the city faced an impossible challenge. How do you maintain Roman urban standards with Germanic resources and institutions? Theodoric's solution was absolutely brilliant. He created the world's first truly multicultural urban administration. Instead of imposing either Roman or Germanic institutions, Theodoric developed a hybrid system that combined the best features of both. Roman law continued to govern commercial disputes and property rights. Germanic customs handled military organization and personal relationships. Christian institutions provided social services and education. And everyone, Roman, Germanic, and Arian Christian, had representation in the city's governing council. According to historian Peter Heather's research, this multicultural approach made Ravenna incredibly attractive to refugees, merchants, and skilled craftsmen from across the Mediterranean. The city became a safe haven where people of different backgrounds could cooperate rather than compete. Ravenna's population actually grew during the 6th century, even as most European cities were shrinking. The economic results were remarkable. Ravenna's workshops produced luxury goods that combined Roman techniques with Germanic artistic styles, creating products that appealed to customers across cultural boundaries. The city's merchants developed trade relationships with Byzantine, Islamic and Germanic markets simultaneously, which provided resilience when any single trade route was disrupted. But what really made Ravenna special was its approach to infrastructure. Instead of trying to maintain massive Roman-style public buildings, the city focused on smaller, more sustainable facilities that could actually be afforded and maintained. Public baths were replaced with smaller neighborhood facilities. The enormous circus was converted into workshops and housing. The Forum became a market that operated every day rather than hosting occasional spectacular events. Do you see the pattern emerging from these survival stories? The cities that survived the collapse of Roman civilization weren't the ones that tried to preserve the old systems. They were the ones that adapted to new realities while maintaining what was truly valuable about urban life. All three of these success stories share several crucial characteristics. First, they developed sustainable economies that didn't depend on massive territorial control or complex supply chains. Rome focused on religious services, Constantinople on luxury manufacturing, and Ravenna on multicultural commerce. Second, they invested in human capital rather than just physical infrastructure. Education, expertise, and cultural diversity became more important than massive public buildings. Third, they remained flexible and adaptive, constantly adjusting their strategies as conditions changed. Perhaps most importantly, these cities proved that urban life could survive and even thrive without the imperial framework that had originally created it. They showed that cities weren't just administrative centers or commercial hubs. They were fundamentally about bringing diverse people together to create value that couldn't be achieved in isolation. The lessons from these survival stories would eventually spread across Europe and help inspire the urban revival that would begin in the 11th century. But before we get to that remarkable renaissance, we need to understand what archaeologists have discovered about the actual process of urban abandonment and how those discoveries have completely changed our understanding of what really happened when Roman civilization collapsed. Sometimes the most important stories are buried beneath our feet, waiting for someone with a trowel and infinite patience to uncover them. And what archaeologists have discovered about how Roman cities actually died has completely shattered everything historians thought they knew about the collapse of ancient civilization. The real story isn't what you'd expect. It's far stranger, more gradual, and in some ways more heartbreaking than any dramatic tale of sudden destruction. Let me take you on an archaeological journey that will blow your mind. Picture yourself standing in a muddy excavation pit in the heart of what was once Wroxeter, a major Roman city in western Britain. You're looking at something that seems impossible, layer after layer of archaeological evidence that tells a story completely different from what the history books say. This isn't the sudden abandonment that everyone expected to find. This is something far more mysterious. Dr. Philip Barker spent over 30 years excavating Wroxeter, and what he discovered there revolutionized our understanding of urban collapse. Instead of finding evidence of violent destruction or sudden abandonment, he found something that initially baffled him: careful, deliberate adaptation that stretched over centuries. Here's what the archaeological layers reveal. In the late 4th century, Wroxeter was still a thriving Roman city with stone buildings, paved streets, and all the amenities of urban life. But by the early 5th century, something fascinating was happening. Instead of maintaining the massive stone basilica in the city centre, residents began carefully dismantling it, not destroying it, but systematically removing stones for reuse in new construction projects. But here's the really mind-blowing part. They weren't abandoning the site. They were rebuilding it using completely different architectural principles. Where the stone basilica had stood, archaeologists found evidence of large timber buildings constructed with sophisticated joinery techniques. These weren't primitive huts. They were well-designed wooden structures that could house hundreds of people. Can you imagine the practical intelligence this required? The residents of Wroxeter looked at their crumbling Roman infrastructure and made a conscious decision. Instead of trying to maintain buildings that required Roman-level resources, they would create new buildings using locally available materials and techniques. This pattern of adaptive reuse has been found at archaeological sites across the former Roman Empire, and it's completely changing how we understand the transition from Roman to post-Roman society. Instead of sudden collapse, archaeologists are finding evidence of gradual, intelligent adaptation to changing circumstances. Let me show you another example that's even more remarkable. At Silchester, another major Roman city in Britain, archaeologist Professor Michael Fulford made a discovery that initially seemed impossible. In the ruins of what had been a Roman forum, his team found evidence of 6th century metalworking shops, grain storage facilities, and residential areas. But here's what's truly extraordinary. These post-Roman inhabitants weren't squatting in ruins. They were running sophisticated manufacturing operations. Chemical analysis of metal slag from these workshops shows that 6th century craftsmen in Silchester were producing iron tools and weapons that were actually superior in some ways to earlier Roman products. Think about what this means. The people living in abandoned Silchester had maintained enough technical knowledge and social organization to operate complex industrial processes. They weren't primitive survivors eking out a living in ruins. They were skilled craftsmen serving regional markets with high-quality products. Professor Fulford's most recent research, published in 2021, suggests that this pattern was far more common than anyone previously imagined. Across Britain, abandoned Roman cities show evidence of continued occupation and economic activity well into the 7th and 8th centuries. The cities weren't dying, they were transforming into something completely different. But perhaps the most shocking archaeological discoveries have come from continental Europe, where researchers are finding evidence that some Roman cities never actually lost their urban character at all. They just became invisible to traditional historical sources. Take the case of Tours in central France. Historical documents from the 6th and 7th centuries describe Tours as a declining provincial town with a small population clustered around religious buildings. But archaeological excavations led by Professor Henri Galinier tell a completely different story. Beneath the medieval city centre, Galinier's team has uncovered evidence of continuous urban activity throughout the so-called Dark Ages. They've found sophisticated workshops, commercial districts, and residential areas that operated without interruption from the Roman period through the Carolingian Renaissance. The archaeological evidence suggests that Tours maintained a population of 15,000 to 20,000 people, even during the supposed period of urban decline. So why did historical sources describe Tours as a declining town? The answer reveals something fascinating about how our understanding of history can be distorted by the biases of ancient writers. Most of our written sources from this period were produced by Christian clerics who had very specific ideas about what constituted proper urban life. To them, a city without classical Roman institutions, without a forum, public baths, theatrical performances and pagan festivals, wasn't really a city at all, even if it had thousands of residents engaged in sophisticated economic activities. It's like having historians from another culture describe modern Las Vegas as abandoned, because it doesn't have the same institutions as ancient Athens. The bias in their sources made them miss the actual urban life that was happening right in front of them. Dr. Chris Wickham from Oxford has analysed this problem extensively, and his research suggests that our entire understanding of early medieval urban decline may be fundamentally flawed. Instead of cities disappearing, we may be seeing cities transforming in ways that made them invisible to the people who are writing the histories. But the most mind-blowing archaeological discoveries have come from underwater excavations that are revealing trade networks and urban connections that historical sources never mentioned. In the Mediterranean, marine archaeologists have discovered hundreds of shipwrecks from the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries loaded with commercial cargo. These ships were carrying wine, olive oil, pottery and manufactured goods between ports across the Mediterranean, evidence of continued trade networks that supposedly didn't exist during the Dark Ages. Professor Sean Kingsley's research on underwater archaeology has identified over 300 shipwrecks from this period, suggesting that Mediterranean commerce remained much more active than previously thought. The archaeological evidence indicates that cities like Naples, Palermo and Venice maintained substantial trade relationships throughout the supposed period of urban collapse. What's really fascinating is that many of these trade relationships were completely unknown to historians because they weren't recorded in surviving written sources. The ships were carrying goods between smaller ports and regional markets that didn't leave the kind of official records that larger imperial trade networks had generated. Perhaps most remarkably, recent archaeological work in Eastern Europe has revealed that some regions actually experienced urban growth during the period when Western European cities were supposedly collapsing. Excavations in Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic have uncovered evidence of new town foundations, expanding craft production, and increased long-distance trade during the 6th and 7th centuries. These regions were developing urban networks just as Western Europe was supposedly losing them. Professor Florin Curta from the University of Florida has argued that what we call the fall of Roman civilization might be better understood as a geographical shift in urban development. Instead of cities disappearing, urban life was moving to new regions and taking new forms that traditional historical sources didn't recognize or record. But here's what I find most fascinating about all these archaeological discoveries. They're showing us that human societies are far more resilient and adaptable than we usually give them credit for. Even when massive institutional systems collapse, people find ways to maintain the essential functions of urban life: production, trade, social cooperation, and cultural development. The residents of post-Roman cities weren't passive victims of historical forces beyond their control. They were active agents who made intelligent decisions about how to adapt their communities to changing circumstances. They preserved what was valuable about urban life while discarding what had become unsustainable. And this archaeological evidence is forcing us to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about how civilizations rise and fall. Maybe the story isn't about the triumph of barbarism over civilization, or the victory of rural simplicity over urban complexity. Maybe it's about human communities learning to reorganize themselves when the old systems no longer work. These discoveries are also teaching us something crucial about resilience and adaptation that has profound implications for our own time. Because while archaeologists were uncovering the truth about how Roman cities really died, another group of scholars was making equally remarkable discoveries about how European cities eventually came back to life. Then came the miracle that nobody saw coming. Around the year 1000 AD, after 5 centuries of supposed urban decline, something extraordinary began happening across Europe. Cities weren't just surviving anymore, they were exploding back to life with an energy and innovation that would make even the Romans jealous. But here's the twist. These weren't the old Roman cities reborn. They were something completely new, built on principles that the ancient world had never imagined. Welcome to the story of history's greatest urban comeback, and it all started in the most unlikely place: a muddy lagoon where desperate refugees were about to invent the future. Picture yourself standing on a small island in the Venetian lagoon around 1050 AD. There's no grand architecture here, no marble palaces, no aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant mountains. What you see instead are wooden houses built on stilts, connected by rickety bridges, surrounded by salt marshes that smell distinctly fishy. If someone told you this swampy refugee camp would become one of history's greatest cities, you'd probably laugh, but you'd be witnessing the birth of something revolutionary, the world's first truly capitalist city. Venice wasn't trying to recreate Roman urban life. It was inventing something completely different. Instead of depending on territorial control, agricultural surpluses, or imperial administration, Venice built its entire economy around a radical new idea: that private merchants, working together through voluntary associations, could create wealth and power that exceeded anything achieved by traditional empires. Let me show you exactly how this worked, because Venice's success story reveals the secret formula that would transform European urban life forever. The key was something that the Roman world had never fully developed: sophisticated commercial partnerships that could pool resources, share risks, and coordinate complex business ventures across vast distances. Venetian merchants didn't just trade goods. They created what we'd recognize today as investment firms, insurance companies, and multinational corporations. According to economic historian Frederick Lane's groundbreaking research, a typical Venetian trading venture in the 12th century might involve dozens of investors, multiple ships, and commercial operations spanning from London to Constantinople. But here's what made it revolutionary. These partnerships were based on written contracts, standardized accounting practices, and legal frameworks that protected private property and enforced commercial agreements. The numbers are absolutely staggering. By 1200 AD, Venice's annual trade volume exceeded 10 million Byzantine gold pieces, roughly equivalent to the GDP of entire kingdoms. But here's what's really mind-blowing. This wealth was created by a city with fewer than 100,000 residents, operating from a collection of muddy islands with no natural resources whatsoever. How is this possible? Venice had discovered something that would revolutionize urban civilization: the power of specialized knowledge and flexible institutions. Instead of trying to produce everything they needed locally, Venetians became masters of what we'd call today value-added services. They didn't grow grain. They financed grain purchases and transported grain between regions where it was needed. They didn't manufacture silk. They imported raw silk from Constantinople and finished silk products from China, then matched buyers and sellers across Europe. But perhaps most importantly, Venice developed institutional innovations that made complex commercial operations both possible and profitable. They created standardized weights, measures, and currency systems that were accepted across the Mediterranean. They established commercial courts that could resolve disputes quickly and fairly. They invented forms of commercial insurance that protected merchants against the risks of long-distance trade. Can you see how different this was from the Roman approach? Roman cities had been administrative centers that extracted wealth from surrounding territories. But Venice was a wealth creation center that generated prosperity through innovation and voluntary exchange. And Venice wasn't alone. Across northern Italy, similar commercial republics were emerging with equally remarkable success stories. Take Genoa, which by 1150 AD had become the Mediterranean's greatest naval power, despite controlling almost no territory beyond its immediate harbour. Genoese merchants financed the Crusades, established trading colonies from Spain to the Black Sea, and developed banking techniques that would later be adopted across Europe. Or consider Pisa, which built its prosperity on maritime commerce and technological innovation. Pisan merchants developed new forms of navigation, shipbuilding, and commercial organization that made long-distance trade safer and more profitable than ever before. But the most remarkable success story came from an even more unlikely place. Florence, a landlocked city in central Italy that became medieval Europe's financial capital despite having no obvious economic advantages. Florence's story is absolutely fascinating because it shows how medieval cities could create prosperity through pure intellectual innovation. Florentine bankers didn't just lend money, they invented sophisticated financial instruments that allowed merchants to conduct business across continents without physically transporting coins. According to historian Richard Goldthwaite's research, Florentine banking houses like the Medici developed credit systems so advanced that a merchant in London could write a letter of credit that would be honoured by banks in Cairo, Constantinople or Seville. They created what was essentially the medieval equivalent of international wire transfers. But here's what really made Florence special. It became a centre for what we'd recognise today as financial services. Instead of producing physical goods, Florence specialised in providing the financial tools that made other people's production and trade possible. Florentine banks financed wool production in England, silk manufacturing in Constantinople, and spice trading in Alexandria. The wealth this generated was extraordinary. By 1300 AD, Florence's per capita income was higher than most European regions would achieve until the Industrial Revolution. A successful Florentine banker lived better than most medieval kings. But these Italian commercial republics were just the beginning. The urban revival was spreading across Europe, taking different forms in different regions, but always based on the same revolutionary principle, that cities could create wealth through innovation, specialization, and voluntary cooperation, rather than territorial control and resource extraction. In Northern Europe, cities like Bruges, Ghent and Antwerp became manufacturing centres that produced high-quality textiles using new production techniques and organisational methods. Instead of the small-scale craft workshops that had characterised early medieval production, these cities developed what historian Martha Howell calls proto-industrial manufacturing systems. Flemish cloth production, for example, involved complex supply chains that brought raw wool from England, processed it through dozens of specialised workshops in Flemish cities, and exported finished products to markets across Europe and the Mediterranean. This wasn't just local craft production, it was the medieval equivalent of modern manufacturing industries. Meanwhile, German cities along the Baltic coast were creating something equally revolutionary, the Hanseatic League, which was essentially the world's first multinational trading corporation. Hanseatic merchants established a commercial network that stretched from London to Novgorod, coordinating trade policies, standardizing commercial practices, and protecting member cities' interests through collective action. The scale of Hanseatic operations was enormous. According to research by Philippe Dollinger, the League at its peak included over 200 cities and controlled trade routes worth millions of marks annually. But what made it truly revolutionary was its organizational structure. It was a voluntary association of independent cities that cooperated for mutual benefit without surrendering their local autonomy. Do you see the pattern emerging? These medieval cities weren't trying to recreate the Roman Empire's centralized territorial model of urban organization. They were inventing something completely new. Networks of independent cities that specialized in different functions, but cooperated through voluntary agreements and market relationships. This represented a fundamental shift in how human societies could organize themselves. Instead of depending on imperial conquest and territorial control, these cities proved that voluntary cooperation and specialized production could generate unprecedented levels of prosperity and innovation. But perhaps most remarkably, this urban revival was happening without the massive infrastructure investments that had characterized Roman cities. Medieval cities didn't need enormous aqueducts, vast road networks, or complex imperial administrations to thrive. They needed something much simpler, but much more sophisticated. Institutions that facilitated voluntary cooperation between independent economic actors. The lessons these medieval cities learned about urban organization, commercial innovation, and institutional development would eventually spread across the globe and become the foundation for modern urban civilization. But before we explore those connections, we need to understand what all of this teaches us about the eternal challenges facing urban communities. The story we've just told isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint for understanding the challenges facing every modern city today. Because as I've been researching this incredible journey through Roman urban collapse and medieval revival, I've been struck by how many of the same patterns, the same vulnerabilities, and the same solutions keep appearing throughout history. And some of the parallels to our contemporary world are frankly terrifying. Let me show you what I mean by taking you on a quick tour through some modern cities that are facing remarkably similar challenges to what Roman cities experienced 1500 years ago. Start with Detroit. In 1950, Detroit was one of America's most prosperous cities, with nearly 2 million residents, thriving industries, magnificent public buildings, and the economic foundation to support a sophisticated urban lifestyle. Sound familiar? It should. That's almost exactly how we described cities like Trier or Antioch at their Roman peaks. But by 2010, Detroit's population had fallen to fewer than 700,000 people, a 65% decline that rivals the demographic collapse of post-Roman cities. Large sections of the city were essentially abandoned, with nature reclaiming former residential neighborhoods, just like weeds growing through the ruins of Roman forums. What happened? The same basic pattern we've seen throughout this story. The economic foundation that had sustained urban life simply disappeared. When automobile manufacturing moved to other regions and countries, Detroit lost the specialized economic activity that had made it a magnet for workers and investment. Without that economic engine, the city couldn't maintain its infrastructure, provide adequate services, or attract new residents. Does this sound eerily familiar? It should, because it's essentially the same process that hollowed out Roman cities when trade networks collapsed and economic activity shifted to new regions. Or consider what's happening to many Rust Belt cities across the American Midwest. Cities like Akron, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, and Youngstown, Ohio have all experienced dramatic population declines as their economic foundations. Steel production, rubber manufacturing, heavy industry have moved elsewhere or become obsolete. According to research by urban planner Justin Hollander at Tufts University, over 100 American cities have lost more than 25% of their population since 1950. That's a demographic decline comparable to what happened to European cities during the collapse of Roman civilization. But here's what's really fascinating. Some modern cities are finding ways to adapt and reinvent themselves that mirror the survival strategies we saw in places like Rome, Constantinople, and Ravenna. Take Pittsburgh, which lost over 60% of its population between 1950 and 2010 as its steel industry collapsed. Instead of trying to recreate its industrial past, Pittsburgh reinvented itself as a center for healthcare, education, and technology. The city leveraged its existing universities and medical institutions to attract new kinds of economic activity that didn't depend on heavy manufacturing. Sound familiar? That's exactly what Rome did when it transformed from an imperial administrative centre into a religious tourism destination, or what Constantinople did when it became a centre for luxury manufacturing and knowledge-based industries. Or look at what's happening in Barcelona, which has become one of Europe's most successful cities by specialising in what economists call the creative economy: design, architecture, technology, and cultural production. Barcelona doesn't compete with other cities by trying to have the lowest costs or the biggest factories. Instead, it attracts residents and investment by offering unique cultural amenities and creative opportunities that can't be found anywhere else. That's essentially the same strategy that medieval Venice used. Instead of trying to compete on basic production, focus on specialised, high-value activities that require unique expertise and cultural resources, but the parallels go deeper than just economic strategies. Modern cities are also grappling with infrastructure challenges that would be very familiar to late Roman administrators. Think about the crisis facing American urban infrastructure today. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that it would cost over $2 trillion to bring American roads, bridges, water systems and public transit up to adequate standards. That's roughly equivalent to the infrastructure maintenance crisis that contributed to the collapse of Roman urban systems. And just like Roman cities, many modern American cities are discovering that they simply can't afford to maintain the infrastructure they've inherited from more prosperous eras. Cities across the country are facing impossible choices. Either raise taxes to levels that drive away residents and businesses, or allow infrastructure to deteriorate until urban life becomes unsustainable. Some cities are responding by adopting what we might call Roman solutions, reducing their geographic footprint, consolidating services, and focusing resources on maintaining smaller areas, rather than trying to provide uniform services across vast territories. Cities like Youngstown, Ohio, and Flint, Michigan have explicitly adopted shrinking city strategies that prioritize sustainable service delivery over territorial expansion. But other modern challenges facing cities are completely unprecedented in human history. Climate change, for example, is creating infrastructure stresses that no previous generation of urban planners had to consider. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities like Miami and Venice. Extreme weather events are overwhelming urban drainage systems from Houston to Mumbai. Prolonged droughts are challenging the water supply systems of cities from Cape Town to Los Angeles. And yet, the basic principles of urban resilience that we've learned from studying Roman and medieval cities still apply. Cities that thrive are the ones that maintain economic diversity, invest in human capital, develop flexible institutions, and preserve the social cooperation that makes urban life possible. Can you see the patterns? Urban success isn't really about having the biggest buildings or the most impressive infrastructure. It's about creating environments where people can cooperate productively, where new ideas can flourish, where economic opportunities can emerge, and where communities can adapt to changing circumstances. The cities that survived the collapse of Roman civilization weren't necessarily the biggest or richest ones. They were the most adaptable ones. Rome survived by reinventing itself around religious rather than political functions. Constantinople thrived by focusing on high-value manufacturing and knowledge production. Venice succeeded by developing new forms of commercial organization. Modern cities facing similar challenges can learn from these historical examples. Instead of trying to preserve obsolete economic structures, they can focus on developing new sources of competitive advantage. Instead of depending on single industries or single revenue sources, they can diversify their economic base. Instead of trying to maintain infrastructure designed for different demographic and economic conditions, they can right-size their physical footprint to match their current resources and needs. But perhaps most importantly, The story of Roman and medieval cities teaches us that urban civilization is both more fragile and more resilient than we usually imagine. Urban life depends on complex systems that can be disrupted by forces beyond any single city's control. Climate change, economic shifts, technological disruption, political instability, or demographic transitions. But urban communities also have remarkable capacities for adaptation, innovation, and reinvention. When old systems stop working, urban residents can create new institutions, develop new economic strategies, and find new ways to organize their communities. The key is maintaining what urban theorist Jane Jacobs called the underlying conditions of diversity, the social networks, cultural institutions, and economic relationships that make urban innovation possible. Cities that preserve these underlying conditions can survive almost any external shock. Cities that lose them may struggle even in favourable circumstances. And that brings us to the most important lesson of all from this incredible journey through urban rise, fall, and renewal. Because understanding how cities have adapted to existential challenges in the past isn't just about appreciating history, it's about preparing for the future. So here we are, at the end of our incredible journey through time, and I want to leave you with something that might just change how you see the world around you. Because the story of Roman cities isn't really about the past. It's about the eternal human challenge of building communities that can thrive, adapt, and endure in an unpredictable world. Think about what we've discovered together tonight. We've seen how the greatest urban civilization in ancient history was brought down not by a single catastrophic event, but by the gradual breakdown of interconnected systems, economic networks, political institutions, infrastructure maintenance, social cooperation, and cultural confidence. It's a reminder that civilization isn't a fixed achievement. It's an ongoing project that requires constant attention, adaptation, and renewal. But we've also seen something profoundly hopeful. Human communities have an almost miraculous capacity for reinvention. When the Roman world collapsed, people didn't just give up and retreat to caves. They created new forms of social organization, developed new economic strategies, built new institutions, and eventually created urban civilizations that surpassed their Roman predecessors in many ways. The medieval cities that emerged from the ruins of the Roman world, Venice with its revolutionary commercial innovations, Florence with its financial genius, the Hanseatic League with its cooperative networks, these weren't just pale imitations of Roman greatness. They were genuinely new forms of human organization that solved problems the Romans had never figured out, and that gives me enormous hope for our own time, because the challenges facing modern cities, climate change, technological disruption, economic inequality, infrastructure decay, political polarization, are in many ways just new versions of ancient problems. The specific details are different, but the underlying dynamics are remarkably similar. Let me share with you the 3 most important lessons I've learned from studying urban resilience across 15 centuries of history, because I think they might help you understand not just your own city, but your own community and even your own life. First, diversity is strength, but it requires active cultivation. The cities that survived and thrived, whether we're talking about Constantinople in the 6th century or San Francisco today, were the ones that maintained economic diversity, cultural diversity, and institutional diversity. They didn't put all their eggs in one basket. They created multiple pathways to prosperity, multiple sources of identity, and multiple ways of solving problems. But diversity doesn't happen automatically. It requires deliberate choices, choosing to welcome newcomers rather than exclude them, choosing to support multiple industries rather than depending on just one. choosing to preserve different neighborhoods and communities rather than forcing everything into a single mold. Second, infrastructure is important, but institutions are everything. Roman cities had the most impressive infrastructure in the ancient world, but when their institutions collapsed, their systems of governance, law, trade, and social cooperation, even the most magnificent aqueducts and roads became useless. Modern cities spend billions on physical infrastructure, and that's important. But the most successful cities also invest in what we might call social infrastructure. The schools, libraries, community centres, and civic organisations that help people work together effectively. They create institutions that can adapt to new challenges rather than just maintain old systems. Third, the secret to urban success isn't avoiding change, it's managing change intelligently. The cities that failed during the collapse of Roman civilization were often the ones that tried hardest to preserve the old ways of doing things. The cities that succeeded were the ones that remained flexible, experimental, and open to new possibilities. That doesn't mean abandoning everything that worked in the past. Rome survived by preserving what was valuable about Roman culture while adapting to new circumstances. Venice succeeded by combining traditional Mediterranean trading practices with innovative financial techniques. The most resilient cities learn how to be both conservative and revolutionary at the same time. Now, I want you to think about your own community. Whether it's a big city, a small town, or just your neighbourhood, what would it look like to apply these lessons? How could you help build more diversity, stronger institutions, and better adaptation in the place where you live? Maybe it's as simple as supporting local businesses that aren't part of national chains, creating economic diversity in your community. Maybe it's volunteering for organisations that bring different groups together, building social infrastructure. Maybe it's staying informed about local issues and participating in community decisions, helping your area adapt to new challenges. Because here's what I've realised after spending years studying urban history. Cities aren't just places we live in. They're collective projects we're all constantly creating together. Every choice we make about where to live, where to work, where to shop, how to treat our neighbours, how to participate in community life. All of these individual decisions add up to shape the character and future of our urban communities. The Romans who built Trier and Antioch and Alexandria thought they were building for eternity. And in a way they were right. Their innovations in law, engineering, architecture, and urban planning became the foundation for everything that came after, but they were also wrong, because they thought permanence meant never changing. The real lesson of urban history is that permanence comes through adaptation. The cities that last aren't the ones that never change, they're the ones that keep changing in response to new challenges while preserving what's most valuable about urban life. The opportunity for diverse people to come together, create value, build culture, and solve problems that none of them could handle alone. And that's exactly what's happening right now in cities around the world as people work together to address climate change, technological disruption, economic inequality, and all the other challenges of our time. The story isn't over. It's still being written, and you're part of writing it. The next time you walk through your city, I want you to remember the incredible journey we've taken together tonight. Remember that the streets you're walking have witnessed countless stories of human ingenuity, cooperation, and resilience. Remember that the communities you're part of are continuing traditions of urban innovation that stretch back thousands of years. And remember that the choices you make about how to live, work, and participate in your community are helping to shape the next chapter of urban history. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through time. Thank you for your curiosity, your patience, and your willingness to think deeply about how human communities work and why they matter. And thank you for being part of the ongoing story of urban civilization. because that's exactly what you are. The story of how we build thriving, resilient, adaptive communities isn't just history. It's the future we're creating together,